throughout many years, Juan Manuel Márquez had lived like a person carrying two souls in the same body, a life that no one saw fully, where every step was a tug-of-war between what he showed and what he had to endure. On the ring, he was absolute coldness, an emotionless warrior, someone who could wait for minutes just to throw a punch as accurate as destiny. But inside, he was a man obsessed with things that could not be said. Fights where he believed he had done enough, but still was not recognized. Moments where victory seemed to slip away, just because of decisions beyond his control. He learned to not resist, not complain, not explain, because he understood that in his world, the only voice that had value was action, and that action had to be repeated time after time in silence. That was how he existed, how he protected himself, and also how he isolated himself from the world. There were nights, after the stage lights and the cheers, only a silence so suffocating remained, where he was no longer a champion, but just a man trying to understand why he still had to keep fighting, even though he had won so many times. And it was precisely in that silence that his will was forged. Not to become stronger against opponents, but to not collapse in front of the doubts that never left him. However, if looking at the numbers and titles, people would see a completely different story, a story of glory and dominance. Juan Manuel Márquez was a world champion in 4 different weight classes, an achievement that very few boxers in history have achieved, with WBA and IBF titles in featherweight, then expanding to super featherweight, lightweight, and light welterweight. He won 56 professional fights, in which there were 40 knockouts, a testament to the power and precision of the counter-punching style that he had perfected throughout his career. Victories against top opponents like Marco Antonio Barrera, Juan Diaz, or Joel Casamayor affirmed his status in the elite boxing world. Especially, the legendary knockout against Manny Pacquiao in 2012 not only brought victory, but also became one of the most iconic moments in modern boxing history. He was honored multiple times in pound-for-pound rankings, recognized by major organizations like Ring Magazine and Boxing Writers Association of America, and frequently mentioned as one of the greatest Mexican boxers of all time. But behind all those titles, there still existed a truth that no numbers could fully reflect. That the path to achieving those achievements had never been easy, and the price he had to pay was always greater than what the world saw. Before stepping into the journey, please hit subscribe and leave a heart, as a quiet way to pay respect to the man who fought in silence throughout his life. And if you want to understand what created the man who had to live 2 lives, please stay, because what lies ahead is even more painful than what you just heard. If the first part of Juan Manuel Márquez's life was a question without an answer, then his childhood was where those questions began to form. In a city with no room for weakness, where children were not allowed to grow up slowly, Mexico City was not gentle with dreams, especially with working-class families like the Márquez family, where each passing day carried an invisible pressure to grow up earlier than others, to understand harsh life before having time to understand what a complete childhood was. In the small house where everything operated according to discipline, there was not much space for hugs, not many encouraging words, not moments where a child was allowed to be weak. Juan Manuel grew up in silence, a silence not because of lack of sound, but because of lack of sharing. He was not a noisy child, not someone seeking attention, but a boy who learned to observe, learned to keep everything inside, because that was the only way to exist in an environment where emotions were not encouraged. Simple meals, long days passing with nothing special, and a vague awareness that this life would not change if he did not find his own way out. And then boxing appeared, not as a dream, but as the only door still open, a path no one guaranteed would lead to success, but at least a path that could lead out of the limits tightening around his life. The first days in the gym had no glory, no one standing watching and clapping, no praise, only the smell of sweat, the sound of the heavy bag being hit repeatedly, and the feeling of pain spreading throughout the body every time a punch with incorrect technique was thrown. He fell down more times than he stood up, and each time like that, no one ran to ask if he was okay. No hand pulled him up. Only a familiar silence forced him to stand up himself. That was not cruelty, but reality, a reality he gradually understood that if he could not stand up himself, no one would do it for him. There were training sessions that lasted to the point where the body no longer felt anything, arms trembling from fatigue, breathing becoming heavy. But he still continued, not because he was stronger than others, but because he did not allow himself to stop. No one told him he was doing well. No one guaranteed that all this pain would have meaning, but he still continued, as if inside him there was something that did not allow him to give up. And it was in those moments that a habit gradually formed, a habit not of the body, but of the mind. Enduring without revealing, he learned to hide the pain, not because it disappeared, but because he did not want it to become a weakness. He learned not to show fatigue, not to let others see doubt in his eyes, not to let anyone know that there were times he also wanted to stop. Those emotions did not disappear, they were only pushed deeper inside, accumulating over time, becoming part of who he was. And when he grew up, when he stepped into real fights, when facing stronger, faster, and more dangerous opponents, that very habit became what kept him standing. But the price of it also began to show clearly, because once a child learns not to cry, he also learns not to share, not to seek help, not to allow anyone to enter his inner world. Juan Manuel Márquez not only became a boxer, he became a man who carried everything alone, a person the world could see on the outside but could never touch what was happening inside. And that was where his second life began. Not on the ring, but in the very silence he had learned since he was a child. The silence that Juan Manuel Márquez learned from childhood did not disappear when he entered his adult years. It only changed form, becoming sharper, more disciplined, and more dangerous when he began working under the guidance of Ignacio Beristain, a teacher who did not teach students with gentle words, but with near absolute strictness. In Beristain's gym, there was no room for excess emotions, no room for outbursts, and even less room for excuses. Each training session was a test, not only of physical strength, but of the ability to control oneself, of how calm a boxer could stay when everything around became chaotic. Juan Manuel was not the fastest nor the strongest in the gym, but he had something that Beristain noticed very early, the ability to endure in silence. And instead of turning him into an explosive, attacking boxer like many others, that teacher honed that very silence, turning it into a weapon. He was taught to wait, not passively, but to wait with absolute alertness, observing every small movement of the opponent, remembering every habit, every mistake, and only throwing the punch when the time was ripe. While many young boxers learn to express themselves with consecutive punches, with speed and aggression, Juan Manuel learned to restrain, learned to let the opponent reveal their weaknesses before striking. That was not easy, because human instinct always wanted to react immediately, wanted to counter when attacked, wanted to prove he was not weak. But he had to learn to fight against that very instinct, to hold back the most natural reactions, to replace them with cold calculation. His style gradually changed. No longer a boxer who only knew how to throw punches, but became a person who controlled the rhythm of the fight in his own way. His punches were not many, but each one carried the weight of preparation, of hours of observation, of emotions that had been suppressed and accumulated. People began to realize that when facing Márquez, they were not only facing a boxer, but a mind constantly analyzing, a person who never revealed his true thoughts. Each fight for him was not only a physical confrontation, but a place to release what had been held back for too long. But even in those moments, he still did not allow himself to reveal completely. There were no loud shouts, No overly clear expressions, only a focused gaze and precise movements. Emotions like anger, disappointment, or doubt did not disappear. They were only transformed into energy, kept until they could be used most effectively. Gradually, a clear separation began to form. On the ring, he was a different person, a version that even those closest to him could hardly recognize. It was a warrior without hesitation, without softness, without letting any emotion hinder his decisions. But when he stepped down from the ring, the silence returned, not peace, but a void, where all that had been suppressed came back, heavier, deeper. He did not talk much about what he felt, did not explain, did not complain, because he had grown used to keeping everything to himself. Those around him could see a calm boxer, a disciplined man, but they did not see the inner struggles, the questions he never spoke, the doubts he never shared. And from that, his second life not only existed but became clearer. A life no one saw, but influenced every decision, every step, and every punch he threw on the ring. The years after that did not bring light, as many still thought, but only lengthened a misty path where Juan Manuel Márquez continued to walk without anyone really following. He fought regularly, fight after fight, accumulating victories with the patience and discipline he had trained from the early days. But the outside world seemed unchanged. There were no big articles mentioning his name, no praises, no opportunities placed at the center. Only a series of fights passing in silence, as if all his efforts were happening in a room where no one opened the door to enter. There were boxers who only needed one victory to step into the spotlight, but for him, 10 victories were still not enough to make people stop and pay attention. His record was stable, even superior to many of his contemporaries, but that did not bring him greater opportunities. Promoters looked for names that sold tickets easily, stories that were easy to tell, characters that could create noise. And Marquez was not one of them. He did not talk much, did not draw attention, did not create moments outside the ring to make the public remember him. And in a world where attention was often as important as talent, his silence became a disadvantage. He could not change. Gradually, a hard-to-name feeling began to creep into his thoughts. Not clear anger, but a prolonged vagueness, a repeated question without an answer. What am I missing? He trained hard, fought with discipline, won in the way he had been taught, but still stood outside the opportunities he believed he deserved. Every time he saw other boxers step onto the big stage, mentioned as new stars, he could not help but wonder why his path was so different. There were nights after returning from the gym, body tired but mind unable to rest. He lay there and thought about what he had done, what he could do better, about things he could not control. And in those moments, the belief he had once held firmly began to show small cracks. It was not that he lost faith completely, but he began to doubt. Not doubting his ability, but doubting whether that ability would ever be enough to change the way the world saw him. The feeling of existing but not being recognized became a familiar part of his life, like a shadow that always followed but could not be escaped. On the ring, he was still a precise, disciplined, and dangerous boxer, but outside, he was still just a name that people easily overlooked. The separation between the two people and him became clearer. One person who never stopped advancing, and one person who began to wonder if all those steps really led anywhere. But what made everything heavier was not the lack of recognition from others, but the fact that he could not share that feeling with anyone. He had grown used to keeping everything inside, used to not revealing what he was thinking, and now that very habit made him face it all alone. There was no one for him to say how he was feeling, no one for him to ask if this path was worth continuing. And so, he did the only thing he knew: keep walking. He continued to train, continued to fight, continued to win, as if each fight was one more opportunity to prove he was worthy, even when no one was really watching. But deep inside, something had changed. because for the first time in his life, he was no longer completely sure that just trying hard was enough. And it was in that uncertainty that another battle began, not with an opponent on the ring, but with his own belief, a silent battle, prolonged and without an audience. Then one day, what Juan Manuel Márquez had pursued for so many years finally appeared clearly in his hands. The world titles he had only dared to imagine when he was a boy standing in front of the old heavy bag, now becoming reality. The championship belts in the weight classes that he had traded for every drop of sweat and every accumulated pain over the years. He stepped to the peak that any boxer would crave, becoming a champion with convincing victories, performances that showed near absolute precision, and a fighting style that only those who truly understood boxing could fully appreciate its value. But strangely, when everything should have become clearer, the feeling inside him did not change in the way he had once hoped. The titles were there. The achievements were enough, but the way the world looked at him seemed no different than before. He did not become the center of the stories, did not become the first name mentioned when people talked about the greatest boxers, and the lights continued to point toward others, names that could create more noise, more explosive emotions, more things that were easier to tell. He realized that in a world where attention was part of success, what he did, no matter how precise and persistent, was still not enough to make him a star in the way people expected. There were moments when standing on the ring with the championship belt on his shoulder, looking down at the applauding crowd, he still felt a hard-to-name emptiness, as if everything happening was not completely his. He had won, but the feeling of victory was not complete, as if a part of it had been held back somewhere. In the fights where he was not recognized, in the opportunities he had never been given, in the times when he had to prove more than others, but still received less. And as the years passed, that feeling did not disappear, but became even clearer. He continued to win more victories, continued to solidify his position in the boxing world, but parallel to that was an isolation gradually forming, not because he was separated from the world, but because he began to realize that that world had never truly made room for him in the way he had once hoped. Other boxers could share their joy, could enjoy the lights, could become symbols for something bigger, while he, even standing in the same position, always felt like he was standing on the edge of the very story he had helped create. The silence he carried from the early days did not leave him, but only became deeper, more complex. He did not talk about his feelings, did not complain about how he was perceived, did not try to change his image to become more noticeable. He continued to do the only thing he believed he could control: train, fight, and win. But the more he did so, the more he realized that there were things that could not be changed by effort alone. Things that could not be measured by the number of wins or the number of titles. There were nights when there was no more noise from the crowd, no more stage lights. He sat alone and looked at the championship belts he had won, symbols of success that anyone would dream of, but they did not bring him the complete feeling. He did not deny their value, did not downplay what he had achieved, but he also could not ignore the truth that the path to obtaining them had left gaps that no title could fill. The feeling of winning but not belonging to himself gradually became a familiar part of his life, like a truth he could not change, but also could not fully accept. He still stepped onto the ring with absolute focus, still fought with everything he had, but inside, a question still existed, silent and persistent, whether what he was doing would ever be enough to be recognized in the way he deserved. And while the world continued to move forward, continued to search for new stories and new names, Juan Manuel Márquez still stood there, with everything he had achieved, but still carrying the feeling that a part of his story had never been told fully. And then, when Juan Manuel Márquez thought he had grown used to winning in silence, his life turned in another direction, where every effort was no longer measured by what he did, but by the way people told the story about him. The appearance of Manny Pacquiao not only brought an opponent, but brought a new definition for his entire career. a definition he did not choose but could not avoid. When the two first stepped into the ring together, it was not a story about one dominating the other, but a balanced confrontation to the point that every passing second carried tension. Every punch could change the situation, and every moment made the viewers unable to look away. But when the fight ended, when the scorecards were announced, when the result was recorded in history, what Juan Manuel carried was not clear recognition, but a familiar feeling returning. The feeling that what he had just done was still not enough to make the world see him in the way he deserved. The subsequent encounters did not change that, but only made it heavier. He entered each fight with thorough preparation, with discipline that had become instinct, with everything he had accumulated over many years, and he fought on equal terms, even having moments of superiority. But the final result did not fully reflect what had happened. People began to talk about those fights as chapters in Pacquiao's story, and Juan Manuel gradually became a part of that story. Not the center, but the opponent, the one who helped highlight another journey. The pain did not lie in him losing, but in the way those fights were remembered. Not the moments he fought back, not the resilience he showed, but the final result. A result that tied his name to the role of the one standing behind. The public began to look at him through that lens, not as a champion with his own achievements, but as an opponent of another legend, as if his value only existed in relation to the other person. As more time passed, that image became clearer in the eyes of the public. The articles, the discussions, the rankings, all placed him in a position he did not choose, a position he could not escape just by continuing to beat others, because, in the eyes of many, the story had already been written, and he was only a part of it. An important part, but not the main one. The pressure from that did not come noisily, but accumulated little by little. Just like the way he had grown used to enduring since he was a child. He did not stand in front of the camera to talk about the injustice, did not try to change the way people told the story, did not demand recognition, but inside, he understood better than anyone that if he did not do something different, if he did not create a moment that could not be ignored, then that image would follow him to the end of his career. Every time he stepped into the gym, every time he prepared for a new fight, he was not only training to beat the opponent, but also to fight against the way the world saw him. He carried all the previous fights, all the controversial results, all the moments when he felt he had done enough but still was not recognized, and he turned them into motivation, not to explode, but to keep moving forward. But the more he tried, the more he realized that this was no longer just a battle on the ring, but a battle with the story that others had written about him. And in that battle, he did not have full control, because it did not only depend on what he did, but also on the way people looked, the way people remembered, and the way people retold it. Therefore, Juan Manuel Márquez continued to walk in his familiar silence, carrying both lives he had lived for many years, one life where he fought and won, and one life where he was still trying to find a way for his story to be told in the way it truly deserved. What happened after that was no longer simply fights recorded by scores, but became a series of hard-to-name memories, where Juan Manuel Márquez had to face something heavier than failure, the feeling that the result did not reflect what he had traded. Controversial decisions did not appear once, but repeated in a way that he could not ignore, as if every time he came closer to recognition, something pulled him back to the starting point. He was not the only one in boxing history to fall into that situation, but the way he had to live with it, the way he carried it through every training session, every fight, made his story different, silent but persistent. He did not step in front of the camera to protest, did not use words to justify, did not try to convince the world that he had been treated unfairly. The silence he had learned since he was a child now became the only choice he believed he could control. But that silence did not mean he did not feel the weight of what had happened. On the contrary, precisely because he did not speak it out, everything seemed to sink deeper, cling tighter, becoming part of the thoughts he carried every day. In the gym, with no audience, no lights, only the familiar sounds of gloves hitting the heavy bag, of footsteps moving on the floor, of breathing growing heavier over time. There, he did not need to explain anything to anyone, did not need to prove himself right or wrong, only needed to focus on every movement, every punch, as if each repetition was a way to erase what he could not change. But the more he trained, the more he realized that there were things that could not be erased. Not because he had not tried hard enough, but because they had never been under his control from the beginning. There were times when, standing in front of the mirror after training, looking at himself, he did not only see a boxer, but a man trying to understand what had happened to his life. He did not seek pity, did not expect anyone to stand on his side, but he also could not stop himself from thinking about the fights that had passed, about the moments when he believed he had done enough to win. Those thoughts did not disappear over time, but became a form of obsession, not noisy but always present, like an echo he could not turn off. And it was precisely in those silences that he began to understand that his battle was not only with the opponents in front of him, but with what had been lost and could not be taken back. Not titles, not money, but the feeling of being fully recognized, the feeling that what he had done had value in the way he believed. But when that did not happen, he had no choice but to continue, because stopping meant accepting that everything he had gone through only stopped there. Amid all that, family became the only place where he could return without having to carry the burden of unanswered questions. There, he was not a boxer who needed to prove anything, not a name tied to controversies, but just a husband, a father, an ordinary person in a world that did not demand he be perfect. The stability that family brought did not erase what he had gone through, but at least it gave him a support, a place where he could temporarily set down the heavy thoughts he never shared with anyone. But even there, in the rare, peaceful moments, he still carried a part of the battle he had never truly ended. Because what had happened could not be forgotten, and what he felt could not be denied. He continued to live, continued to train, continued to prepare for the next fights. But now, every step carried not only the goal of winning, but also something deeper, a need that could not be put into words, a desire that one day what he had endured would be recognized in the way he had always believed it deserved. Time does not spare anyone, and for Juan Manuel Márquez, it did not come noisily, but very slowly, very quietly, creeping into every movement, every training session, every moment that before he could control easily. After many years of fighting at the highest level, his body began to speak in a way he could not ignore. Not with sudden intense pain, but with small signs, slower reflexes, longer recovery after each fight, mornings when the body was no longer ready as before. But like the way he had lived since he was a child, he did not talk about it, did not complain, did not let anyone see that inside everything was changing. The injuries accumulated over the years did not disappear after each fight. They stayed, piling up on each other, becoming part of his body. Every punch taken, every time he fell, every moment he had to brace and endure left a mark, and over time, those marks began to affect the way he moved, the way he threw punches, the way he kept balance in situations that before he could handle perfectly. But what made everything more difficult was not the body weakening, but the fact that he did not allow himself to acknowledge it. He continued to train with the same intensity, continued to push himself beyond limits as if only by trying hard enough he could keep the version of himself from the past. And then, when the physical pressures were not yet heavy enough, another challenge appeared, not from the ring but from outside, where his reputation was put into a question he never thought he would have to answer. Doping suspicions began to appear, not in the form of a clear conclusion, but in the form of whispers, suspicious looks, questions that no one asked directly, but everyone thought about. In a world where reputation could be changed by just a rumor, He suddenly found himself in a position where everything he had built could be shaken in just one moment. He was not found guilty, not stripped of titles, not banned from fighting, but that was not enough to erase what had been planted in the public's mind. Some people began to look at him differently, no longer fully trusting what he had done, no longer looking at his victories in the way they once did. And for a person who had devoted his entire life to proving himself through action, being questioned about his honesty was something harder to accept than any failure on the ring. But once again, he chose silence. He did not step forward to explain, did not try to argue, did not seek to change the story being told. He continued to do what he had always done: train, fight, and keep everything inside. But this time, the silence was no longer an easy choice, but a burden, because he knew that no matter what he did, there would still be people who would never fully trust. His spirit began to be eroded in a way no one could see from the outside. It was not a sudden collapse, but a slow process, where each passing day carried a bit of fatigue, a bit of doubt, a bit of loss that he could not name. He still stood firm, still fought, still maintained the image of a disciplined and calm boxer. But inside, he had to face another battle, a battle with no clear opponent, no rounds, no bell to signal the beginning or end. There were moments when everything became too heavy. He might have thought about stopping, not because he no longer had the ability, but because he had had to carry too much for too long. But then, like every time before, he did not stop. Not because he did not feel tired, but because he did not know how to give up. And perhaps that was exactly what kept him continuing to walk, even though the road ahead was no longer as clear as before. Even though the body was no longer as strong as before. Even though the mind was no longer completely at peace. A body gradually breaking under the weight of time. A soul still trying to endure everything it had accumulated. That was the state Juan Manuel Márquez carried as he stepped into the next phase of his life. And whether the world saw it or not, whether they trusted or not, he still continued, not to prove anything to others, but to hold firm to the only thing he had never lost, the will of a person who did not allow himself to collapse. What remains after all of it is not simply the fatigue of the body, but a state in which Juan Manuel Márquez understands that he no longer has much time to change the way the world perceives him. The fight ahead is not called the final fight, but deep down, he knows that this could be the last chance to rewrite the story that has followed him for many years. A story that he was not the one who started, but in which he has been trapped for too long. When the name of Manny Pacquiao once again appears opposite him, the feeling is no longer the same as before, no longer excitement, no longer the pressure of having to prove himself, but a terrifying calm, as if everything he has been through is converging into a single point. The preparation process begins not with big declarations, but with familiar silence. The training room becomes the only place where he allows himself to exist completely, without noise, without lights, without questions from the outside. Each morning starts earlier. Each training session lasts longer, not because he wants to prove that he is still strong, but because he understands that this time, everything must be absolutely precise. There is no room for mistakes, no second chance. What he has lost in the past cannot be recovered, but the way he ends this story is still in his hands. The pressure is present in every small detail, not pressure from the public, but pressure from everything he has carried with him for many years. The previous fights, the controversial decisions, the times he believed he had done enough but was still not recognized, all of them become part of the preparation process. But instead of letting them weigh him down more, he begins to see them differently, no longer as failures, but as lessons, things that have taught him how to endure, how to wait, and most importantly, how not to let emotions control his actions. There is a clear change in the way he perceives this fight. It is no longer a confrontation between two fighters, but a confrontation between the past and the present, between everything he has been through and everything he has left. He is no longer afraid, not because he does not understand the risks, but because he has lived long enough with losses to know that fear no longer has the right to control him. When a person has gone through enough disappointments, enough doubts, enough times being placed in the wrong position, the fear of failure no longer carries the same meaning as before. It becomes smaller compared to the need to be recognized in the right way. In the final days before the fight, everything around seems to blur. Voices from the outside no longer matter. Predictions, analyses, questions about who will win no longer affect him. He does not try to listen, does not try to respond, because he understands that all of those things cannot change the only thing that is important: what will happen in the moment he steps into the ring. His focus reaches a level that even those around him can feel. Not tension, but a profound calm, as if everything inside has been rearranged, no longer chaotic, no longer scattered. Family is still there, like an unchanging anchor. But even when he is with them, he still keeps a certain distance, not because he does not want to share, but because he cannot. There are things that cannot be expressed in words. There are emotions that cannot be explained. And he has become accustomed to keeping them to himself. This fight is not something he can share, not something he can put on someone else's shoulders. It is his alone, like everything he has carried throughout his life. As fight day approaches, there is nothing left to add, nothing left to change. Everything that could be done has been done. Everything that could be prepared has been prepared. And in that moment, he faces a truth that he has avoided for a long time. This is the last chance to change the way the world perceives him. Not through words, not through explanations, but through an action that cannot be misunderstood. He enters the fight not with hope, but with acceptance. Acceptance that the result may not be as expected. Acceptance that the world may still not change. But also acceptance that if there is any moment he can fully control, then it is this moment. And with everything he has been through, everything he has endured, Juan Manuel Márquez is no longer looking for perfection. He is only looking for one single thing, an ending that he can call his own. And then that moment comes. Not with a big explosion, not with a series of relentless punches as people usually imagine, but with a brief instant, a moment where time seems to stop, where everything Juan Manuel Márquez has carried for more than 20 years suddenly converges into a single point. When he throws that punch at Manny Pacquiao, there is nothing superfluous, no hesitation, no outburst of emotion, only the absolute precision of a man who has waited too long for a moment like this. And when the opponent falls, when the whole world sinks into a silence that lasts only a few seconds but is enough to become eternal, people know that they have just witnessed something far beyond an ordinary fight. But what makes that moment different is not only the knockout, but what lies behind it. Because for Juan Manuel Márquez, it is not just a victory, but the accumulation of thousands of hours of training, of fights that were misunderstood, of decisions he could not control, of the years he had to stand in the shadow of the very story that others wrote. All of that does not disappear in that moment, but it is released in a way that no words can describe. The strange thing is, when everyone is waiting for an explosive reaction, a frenzied celebration, a manifestation of relief after everything he has been through, Marquez just stands there, calm to the point of being almost cold. There are no punches thrown into the air, no screams, no obvious tears, only a downward gaze, as if he is trying to confirm that what just happened is real. His silence is not a lack of emotion, but because the emotion has exceeded the ability to express it. Because there are things that when accumulated for too long, they cannot explode in the usual way. They only settle down, deep and heavy. The whole world begins to look back, not just at the fight that just ended, but at his entire journey. The previous fights, the times he was placed in second position, the controversial decisions, all suddenly become clearer in the light of this moment. People begin to wonder if they have missed something, if they have perceived him in a fair way or not, if what he has done throughout his career deserves to be reevaluated. And for the first time in many years, the story of Juan Manuel Márquez is no longer told as a side part of someone else's, but begins to be told as its own story, an independent journey, a man who has had to go through so much to be able to stand in that position. But even when the world changes the way it looks, inside him not everything becomes complete. There is a release, a feeling of lightness after everything that has accumulated, but at the same time, there is also a void that this victory cannot fill. Because the years that have passed cannot be turned back, the previous fights cannot be redone, and the feelings he has had to live with for such a long time cannot disappear just because of one moment. This victory may change the way others see him, but it cannot change what he has been through to get here. Perhaps what that moment brings is not perfection, but acceptance. Acceptance that his life will never be told in a simple way, that what he has lost will always be part of the story, and that this victory, no matter how great, is only one chapter in a much longer journey. He does not stand there like a man who has just completed everything, but like a man who has finally gotten an answer, even if that answer is not entirely what he once expected. And in that silence, amid the lights and cheers that are gradually returning, Juan Manuel Márquez still remains the person he has always been, not showing off, not trying to prolong the moment, not trying to turn it into something bigger. Because, for him, what is truly important does not lie in the way the world sees that moment, but in the fact that he has reached it by himself. With everything he has, with everything he has, with everything he has endured, and with the perseverance that not everyone can understand. That moment closes with his silence, but its resonance stretches out in a different way, slower and heavier, because when the lights gradually dim, when the cheers subside, Juan Manuel Márquez has to face a truth that not everyone realizes. This victory comes when most of his career has already passed. It is no longer the beginning of a new journey, no longer a door opening to countless opportunities ahead, but like a period placed at the end of a story that has lasted too long. He has done what he needed to do, but time is no longer ahead for him to enjoy it the way other champions could. There are moments when he looks back. He does not only see that victory, but sees everything that led to it. The previous fights, the opportunities that have passed, the times he stood very close to changing the way the world perceives him, but then could not hold on to it. Those opportunities cannot come back, cannot be redone, and no matter how great the current victory is, it also cannot change the reality that he has had to wait too long to get it. That does not diminish the value of the victory, but it changes the way he feels about it. The relief comes to him, not like a powerful wave, but like a long breath after many years of holding it in, a feeling that finally he no longer has to carry the old question. But along with it is an indescribable regret. Not regret because he has not done enough, but because he has done enough from a very long time ago. It is just that it was not recognized at that time. He knows that, if things had gone differently, if the previous decisions had not been controversial, if the opportunities had been given at the right time, his story could have been different, lighter, more complete. But those things do not belong to the present, and he has no way to change them. The clearest change after that victory is not the way he is perceived, but the way he sees himself. For the first time in many years, he no longer feels the need to prove anything anymore. There are no more training sessions where he wonders if he is good enough. No more fights where he steps in with the burden of having to change the way the world perceives him. He still trains, still maintains discipline, but the inner motivation is different. It no longer comes from the need for recognition, but from a habit that has taken root, a part of the person he cannot separate from. However, that release does not mean completeness. Because even though he no longer needs to prove himself, the years he has been through are still there. Do not disappear, are not erased by a victory, no matter how great that victory is. The times he was placed after others, the fights where he believed he deserved to win, the moments when he felt he was misunderstood, all still a part of the story he cannot separate from. Success does not have the ability to erase the past. It can only highlight it in a different way. Perhaps the hardest thing to accept is not what he has lost, but having to learn to live with them. He cannot go back to change what has happened, cannot ask the world to reevaluate every moment, cannot rewrite the story the way he wants. The only thing he can do is accept that his journey will always carry imperfect parts, gaps that nothing can fill. But right in that acceptance, a certain peace begins to form. Not absolute peace, but a state in which he is no longer haunted by what has passed as before. He still remembers, still feels, but no longer lets them control him. That victory, even though it came late, still gives him something he has been searching for many years. Not recognition from others, but recognition from himself. And perhaps that is why, when looking back, Juan Manuel Márquez does not stand there like a man who has won everything, but like a man who has gone through enough to understand that victory and loss are sometimes not two opposite things. Sometimes they exist together in the same moment, in the same person, creating a feeling that cannot be named, a feeling that only those who have lived through a long journey like him can truly understand. After everything that has happened, after the years in which every step was tied to doubt and the pressure to prove himself, the life of Juan Manuel Márquez gradually shifts to a different rhythm, slower, quieter, and almost completely separate from the world that once followed every fight of his. There are no more big headlines, no more controversies, no more bright lights shining directly into his life. Only a space that he has tried to preserve for many years. Family. That is the part of his life that very few people truly know about. Not because it is intentionally hidden, but because he has never wanted to turn it into a story to tell in front of the public. In his own home, he is not a champion, not a name mentioned in boxing debates, but only a husband, a father, an ordinary man with responsibilities that have nothing to do with the ring. That role does not come with the pressure to prove anything. There is no opponent, no audience, no scoreboard to determine win or lose. And perhaps that is exactly why it becomes the only place where he can exist without having to carry the burden of everything he has been through. He does not appear frequently in the media, does not seek attention, does not exploit his fame to maintain his image in the eyes of the public. In a world where many people try to prolong their fame by all means, his choice seems to go against everything. But it is completely consistent with the person he has always been. He has never needed noise to affirm his value, and when his career ends, he does not need it to continue existing. Family is not only the place he returns to, but also the place where he learns to balance between the two people who have existed in parallel throughout his life. On the ring, he is absolute focus, decisions made in a split second, precision that does not allow mistakes. But in everyday life, he learns to slow down, learns to listen, learns to be present without needing to control everything. That is not an easy transition, because the habits formed over many years cannot disappear in just one moment, but gradually he finds a way for those two people to no longer oppose each other, but to exist together more harmoniously. There are no sensational stories, no scandals that overshadow his career, no moments when his personal life becomes the center of attention. That is not because he has never faced difficulties, but because he has chosen to keep the most important things to himself. While the outside world is always looking for stories to tell, he chooses to keep most of his story in silence, as if that is the only way to protect what he truly cherishes. And perhaps, right in that quietness, he finds something he did not have throughout the years of competing: a space without pressure, No one expects him to win. No one evaluates him through every action. No one compares him to anyone else. Family becomes the only place where he does not need to prove anything, the place where he can exist without needing to be the best version of himself, but just needs to be himself. But even in that peace, what he has been through does not completely disappear. It is still there, like inseparable memories, like a part of the person he has become. The only difference is that now he is no longer dominated by them as before. He does not need to fight them, does not need to find ways to explain or change them, but simply accepts that they are part of the journey that has brought him to where he stands. And in that acceptance, there is a form of peace that he has never known before. Not forgetting, not denial, but a state where the past and the present can coexist without conflict. Juan Manuel Márquez is no longer a person who has to live between two separate lives, but a man who has learned to carry both of those lives within him, without needing to choose one, without needing to abandon one, only needing to continue walking the way he has always done, quietly, persistently, and true to himself. Then one day, what once defined his entire life also stops. Not with a dramatic moment, but with a quiet decision. When Juan Manuel Márquez chooses to step out of the ring, closing a journey that most of his life has been dedicated to pursuing. There are no more grueling training sessions that last until exhaustion. No more nights before fights where sleep is always interrupted by nameless thoughts. No more bells ringing to signal the start or end. And no more moments when all eyes are on him, waiting for something to happen. His departure does not create big waves. There is no noise that people usually see when a legend says goodbye. But it is like the way he has lived, quietly and decisively. Life after retirement does not immediately bring a feeling of relief, as many people think, because when a very large part of life suddenly disappears, the void it leaves is not easily filled. There are no more fights to prepare for, no more opponents to study, no more specific goals to aim for every day. He has to face a completely different reality, where time is no longer divided by training sessions and fights, but stretches slowly and sometimes hard to grasp. He does not completely leave boxing, but his relationship with it has changed. Instead of standing in the ring, he begins to observe from the outside, becoming a commentator, an analyst, a person who shares his experience with the next generations. In that role, he no longer needs to prove anything, no longer needs to win, no longer needs to bear the pressure of the result. He can watch fights with a distance he never had before, understand better what is happening, but at the same time also feel the profound difference between standing outside and actually being in the fight. Supporting young fighters brings him a different feeling, not competition, but continuation. He sees in them what he once had, the desire, the determination, and also the mistakes they may not yet realize. But he does not impose his path on them, does not try to turn them into a version of himself, because he understands that each person must go through their own journey, with all the difficulties and lessons that no one can avoid. When the noise of the ring is gone, when the fast pace of fights is gone, the silence he has been familiar with for a very long time becomes clearer than ever. Before, it always existed but was covered by other sounds, by busyness, by goals that kept appearing. Now, when everything slows down, that silence is no longer a small part of life, but becomes a larger space where he cannot avoid what he has once postponed. The thoughts he once pushed aside, the questions he did not have time to answer, now come back, no longer interrupted, no longer filled by training sessions or fights. He begins to look back at his journey in a different way, not through results, not through titles, but through what he has felt, what he has lost, and what he has kept. There are things he understands more clearly. There are things that still have no answers, but for the first time, he has enough time to truly face them. This transition is not always easy, because a person who is used to always moving forward, always having a specific goal, now has to learn to live with silences, with days when nothing special happens. But gradually, he begins to find a new rhythm, no longer based on tension or pressure, but based on acceptance and a clearer understanding of himself. Juan Manuel Márquez is no longer a person who has to prove anything to the world, no longer a person defined by fights or results. He becomes a different person, not completely separate from the past, but also not bound by it as before. And in the silence, after all the noise, he begins to understand that there are battles that only truly begin when everything on the outside has ended. Battles with no opponent, no audience, only himself and what he has carried throughout his life. Time continues to pass in a way that no one can stop, and for Juan Manuel Márquez, it is not just numbers increasing over the months and years, but very clear changes in his own body, signs that before he could ignore, now can no longer be easily covered. Steps move a little slower. Sudden pains appear in familiar places. Mornings when the body needs more time to start a new day. All remind him that what he has been through does not disappear. They just settle and wait to be felt in a different way. Old injuries are no longer wounds of the past, but become part of the present. More sensitive, clearer, as if his body is retelling its story in a way that needs no words. But not only the body carries the past, his mind does too. Memories of the fights do not disappear when he leaves the ring. They are still there, sometimes appearing in unexpected moments, in an old video, in a conversation, or simply in the quietness of an ordinary evening. He remembers the punches, the movements, the moments when everything happened too fast to think, but he also remembers the seconds when he stood in front of a result he could not change. Those memories are not just images, but also feelings, the feeling of pressure, of hope, of disappointment, all coexisting without a clear boundary. His life slows down, but that slowing down does not mean absolute lightness. There are no more fights, no more clear pressures, but instead a larger space where what remains becomes clearer. Before, everything happened so fast that he did not have time to stop and think, and now he has too much time to do that. And right in those silences, he realizes that there are things that cannot be solved by time, but can only be accepted. Family becomes the center of life in a more complete way, no longer shared with training trips, fights, or other obligations. He is present more, not only physically, but also in presence in every moment. In the small things that before could have been overlooked, meals, conversations, days passing without any special events, all become part of a rhythm of life that he is learning to cherish. But even in that quietness, he does not forget what he has been through. And perhaps he does not want to forget either, because those experiences, even painful or difficult, have shaped the person he has become. The titles, the championship belts, although still there as symbols of success, no longer carry the same meaning as before. They are no longer goals, no longer something to pursue, but become milestones in a long journey. Points he has passed, but not what defines his entire being. What remains, when everything is settled, is not what can be seen or measured, but the experiences, the lessons, the feelings he has carried, and is still carrying. That is how he understands perseverance. About continuing to move forward even when unsure of the outcome, about accepting what cannot be changed, and about finding value in the journey itself, not just in the destination. Juan Manuel Márquez is no longer the person standing amid cheers, no longer the person all eyes are on, but he does not lose his value when he leaves that position. Instead, he carries everything he has been through into another stage of life, where the important things are no longer defined by victory or defeat, but by the way he lives with what remains, and in the way he continues to walk, slower, quieter, but no less steady. It can be seen that his fight has never really ended. It has only changed form, from punches on the ring to reflections in the quietness of himself. And when looking back at that entire journey, from the first days in a small training room where a boy learned to endure in silence, to becoming a name mentioned in boxing history, Juan Manuel Márquez does not appear as an easy story to tell, not a straight line going up, not a series of brilliant consecutive victories, but a journey full of silences, cracks, imperfect things that only when going through long enough, people can see its full meaning. He not only fought opponents standing in front of him on the ring, specific people with their own skills and tactics, but also had to face things without clear shape, voiceless doubts, decisions not in his hands, and a sense of injustice that there is no way to fully explain. Throughout his career, two people always existed in parallel within him, inseparable but never completely one. One is the warrior the world sees, the one who can step into the ring with absolute focus, the one who can throw punches so precise that the opponent cannot react in time, the one whose every movement carries the preparation and discipline accumulated over many years. The other is the person few can reach, the one who carries questions without clear answers, the one who has to live with memories that cannot be erased, the one who learned not to show emotions from a very young age and continues to keep that habit until the end of the journey. The world sees the titles, the championship belts, the statistics that can be recorded and compared. But what they do not see is the majority of the story. They do not see the long training sessions in silence, do not see the moments when he has to stand up by himself without anyone by his side, do not see the times he stepped out of the ring with the feeling that he had done enough but was still not recognized. Those things are not recorded in the achievements, do not appear in the articles, but they are what have shaped him in the deepest way. It can be said that the life of Juan Manuel Márquez is not completely happy in the way many people expect when looking at a champion. It is not filled with constant recognition, does not always bring a feeling of completeness, and there are parts of it that are still unfinished, still with unanswered questions. But at the same time, it is not a fallen life, not a story ending in complete failure or regret. He has stood firm through everything that could make a person falter, has continued to move forward even when unsure that he would be recognized in a deserving way, and has held himself steady in a world that is not always fair. The legacy he leaves is not only in the titles he has won, no matter how valuable they are, but in the way he has gone through his journey. It is perseverance, not in the simple sense of not giving up, but the ability to continue moving forward when everything around does not provide confirmation, when efforts are not immediately reflected, when the road ahead is not clear. It is the ability to endure, not like resignation, but like a way to exist and move forward in a situation that not everyone can understand or accept. And perhaps what makes his story special is not how much he has achieved, but who he has become after everything that has happened. A person who is not perfect, not always winning, not always recognized, but a person who has lived fully with his path, has accepted its imperfect parts, and has found a way to continue without losing himself. When everything has passed, when the noise has settled, when the debates gradually become memories, what remains is not a perfect image, but a real person, with everything he has carried and is still carrying. And in that silence, where there is no longer any need to prove anything to anyone, Juan Manuel Márquez still stands there, not as an untouchable symbol, but as proof that a person can go through an entire life of fighting and still keep himself, whether the world sees it or not. The story of Juan Manuel Márquez is not a simple, heroic epic, but a journey that makes people both respect and feel heartache, because he has had to pay a price that not everyone sees. From a child learning not to cry in a disciplined house in Mexico City, to a fighter who was forgotten despite consecutive victories, then becoming the one always placed behind the shadow of Manny Pacquiao, despite fighting on equal terms, all show a painful paradox. There are people who do everything right, but are still not recognized at the right time. The knockout moment in 2012 should have been a complete peak. But as the story itself has shown, it came too late, when his body had declined, when the years that were overlooked could not be recovered, and when the victory only brought relief, mixed with regret. What makes this story touch the hearts of American audiences is not only the achievement of four-time world champion or 40 knockout wins, but the way he chose silence in the face of doping suspicions, in the face of controversial decisions, and continued training in solitude without seeking pity. In a society that values individual voice and quick recognition, Márquez represents a different kind of strength, perseverance, discipline, and honesty with himself. Even when no one is watching, the lesson here is not in defeating opponents, but in the ability to keep moving forward when you are misunderstood, when efforts are not recognized, and when success does not come at the right time. For Americans, people who live in a highly competitive environment full of pressure for success, Márquez's story reminds that true value does not lie in how much you are noticed, but in how long you can hold yourself steady, even when the world has not yet understood you. If the story of Juan Manuel Márquez makes you think, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a way to honor the man who has fought his whole life in silence. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore the beautiful but painful stories behind the spotlight.